The executive director of Auckland Pride is Max Tweedie. He joins me right now. G'day, Max. Kia ora. Hello. Welcome.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming very, very much. I've just this weekend just gone. There's been like several massive stories that have come out that we're trying to cover off on. So much so that some of them are going to cross over until tomorrow's show to do with, National saying bring back work camps or whatever the fuck they're saying. I don't know, whatever that is. Yeah. So that'll wait. But today we're talking about lowering the youth voting age, which came out today. And on Friday, when we'd already planned a show, there was what is in the weekend actually, hate speech laws are being changed, but not being changed anything like they were proposed to potentially be changed. I've got some thoughts around this, but I'd like to kind of just throw it to you to start off with, because the rainbow community was one of those communities that was said to be a recipient, if that's the right word, of changes for protections in hate speech law. So before we kind of get into the toing and froing of it, what do you want to speak to? Actually, I should probably go what has been proposed in case people haven't picked up on it. That would be what a professional broadcaster would do. So let me bring this up. Under current Human Rights Act, it is illegal to publish or distribute threatening, abusive, or insulting words likely to, quote, excite hostility against or, quote, bring into contempt any group of the grounds of color, race, ethnic or national origins. And the changes, they're bringing religious groups into there as well. They're basically literally adding a word, but the debate beforehand was, the rainbow community, the disabled community, and those groups are not going to be brought in. So now, much like a professional broadcaster would do, I've set it up. What would you like to speak to with that now understanding that we have today?
Yeah, and so we've been, I say we liberally, members of the rainbow community, activists, community organisations, have kind of been involved in this process since, I'd say 2019 was the first meeting that I remember that I was a part of with the Ministry of Justice on this issue. And what was being proposed or talked about at the time was a comprehensive new piece of legislation that was about, incitement to hate and different kind of provisions set out in this legislation, rather than a slight amendment to the existing provisions under the Human Rights Act, as some of those were seen to be an incredibly high threshold. I believe there's only been one prosecution under those laws before, and they've existed for quite a few years. So, that was seen as quite a high threshold, and so government were consulting on bringing that threshold down a bit, and also including a raft of more marginalised communities into that. And yeah, you're right. The government's announcement on over the weekend was that A, that wouldn't be happening, but B, they would just be including religious groups into those protections, just in a specific response, I think, to the March 15 terror attack.
I'm sorry to use a sporting analogy, but I always do because I can't help myself. But like watching the All Blacks play England in the weekend, for those who don't know, it was a draw in the end, kind of felt like kissing your sister. It's just like really weird outcome. And this result now is sort of a bit the same. In fact, Newsroom wrote about this today. I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, but they coined a really interesting phrase. Let me read this out to people. This is just one article, one paragraph from Mark Dolder's article on Newsroom. He says this: narrowing the scope of the protection to just religious groups, so we're talking about adding religious groups, will place a target on the back of religious minorities in an election year, whilst leaving many other vulnerable communities unprotected. So it's like, it's not the best of both worlds. It seems to be like the worst of both worlds that this legislation has come out with.
Yeah, that's quite right. I don't think anyone is particularly thrilled by this announcement. And I think, Mark's analysis is right. And I mean, Mark's been an incredible writer on these issues of counterterrorism, extremism, etc. And so, I think he's absolutely right to say that these religious minorities will feel the pressure of the culture wars around, free speech and freedom that have been whipped up, I think, more recently in response to, COVID-19 and the, appropriate public health measures that were taken. And so I think it's really frustrating because, on one hand, we've got, communities that are then being singled out because of the one horrific incident that took place on the 15th of March, where, 51 people lost their lives. And so the question is kind of raised, well, does that have to happen to every other marginalized community for that to be, is that the threshold? Because,
it's terrifying thought,
it is. And not one that doesn't, to be honest, that feels pretty close to home at the moment. Overnight there was a mass shooting in a gay bar in Colorado Springs in the United States. 22-year-old who was radicalized probably on the internet. And I think was a grandson allegedly, I think, of a MAGA state congressman, a member of their house, and this is not something that's far removed from the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing out of the United States and the impact that it has here. One of the queer churches down in Greymouth was vandalized earlier this year with with homophobic and anti-Semitic remarks, spray painted on the side. The Gender Dynamics and Rainbow Youth Hub in Tauranga was burnt down in an alleged arson attack. Earlier this year as well. These aren't hypotheticals that we're dealing with. We have seen this year 2 specific targeted attacks on very publicly queer buildings, and thank goodness there was no one in them.
Just so so you're clear, my audience will be clear on this. When I like the free speech conversation, and for me, even though I don't think there's absolutes in this world in any case, shape, form whatsoever, I'm someone who, if there was a middle ground, which was 50%, and you could err on the side of like a few more restrictions for safety, or err on the side of more speech for open dialogue, I err on that side. But like I said, understanding that there's no absolutes, right? So I'm not sitting here like the whatever the freedom and speech coalition guy you were talking to this morning was, whatever that was all about. But it does always constantly bring me back to this conversation of like hate speech versus vile speech, and like homophobic slogans on buildings, which we all, well, certainly me, and I'm sure most of my audience abhor and think are repulsive and disgusting, is hate speech. And you said it earlier as well, the incitement to hate. I mean, people are allowed to hate people. People are allowed to encourage people to hate people. Or does it then equal into this area of that incitement to commit violent acts? And I guess for me, I'm unclear on what the legislations would do. And I'm not saying I'm applauding this, because one of my big frustrations with this conversation is it doesn't actually satiate anybody's concerns. Like, it hasn't protected the rainbow community anymore. It hasn't like delivered, I don't know, to the free speech purists what they want. And like I said, it really seems to be in the middle and not doing anything. And I wonder why this government with a majority wouldn't make, they've basically made no decision. They've added a word, yes, but they've basically made no decision, and how making no decision can be seen as useful to anybody in this plethora of opinion on this.
Well, and even just the fact that you and I, two, I would say, politically engaged people having this discussion, don't understand the detail of what the government were originally going to propose, I think says a lot about the frustration that I have. And what I feel this government hasn't been able to do on a number of issues is make the argument. And I think that's what they haven't presented a case that said, actually, we need these provisions to prevent against XYZ. And actually, we already do infringe on an absolute right to free speech in XYZ cases. And we do so because there's demonstrable harm caused if we allow the speech to, be disseminated. And so I think that's part of the problem I have, is that actually, all that was that the conversation around this existed in a vacuum, that all the air, all the oxygen was being taken up by the Free Speech Union and people on the right who were scaremongering about the removal of speech and this, terrible reality where, you just chilling effect where you can't say what you think anymore, kind of thing. And I agree with you. This is vile speech is vile speech. I think it's reprehensible. I don't think it should be illegal. There's a difference for me. And I think the example that, I used this morning, and I think really illustrates this point, is there was a pastor in 2017 who was investigated by police after saying that he doesn't have an issue with gay marriage so long as they're both shot in the head when they kiss. And he was investigated for that, but of course they couldn't do anything because there were no legal provisions against hate speech. Now that is a very clear example of speech that could lead or most likely lead to violence, and is very hateful in that kind of form of describing, killing someone for who they are. That's the type of speech that I think I'm talking about, that our communities are talking about. This really really hateful, violent speech. Not talking about slurs, writings on side of the buildings. No, that's not the type of society that we want to live in. But the way you create that society isn't just banning it wholesale and stopping that conversation. There is a line to be drawn here.
I think one of the problems with this conversation in general, and I'm not trying to message out kind of right-wing tropes. It's not what it's about, but it is a genuine question of mine, and I've asked it before, is who decides the intention of the speech as well? Like, you don't know my background, but I've been heavily involved in the church world. I've lost any opportunity to work in that world back in the past, which I used to do, because of my advocacy for same-sex marriage. And people can just Google my name and LGBT issues, and you'll see all my writings about it. The example you've just given, which I heard you give this morning as well, which obviously I think is disgusting and revolting, but I also wonder, how was it said? What was the connotation? If it was, I mean, I'm not trying to defend that person. I don't want to, but if it was like, I'm okay having an Australian rugby player come over here, but only if we strung him up by the neck. What's the intention behind it? What's the audience? And I'm not saying this to defend him, but I'm like, abhorrent language that for one group of people feels like a danger and threat for the correct reasons, for obvious reasons, to another group might not. And then how do you balance that as well? And that's where the conversation, like for me, what I would need in to see of these law changes is not necessarily tight parameters, but really clear legislation. Like really clear, this is the line. So we don't have to worry, forget today, but let's say in 10 years from now, there's another complete group of politicians or lawmakers running the country that interpret what's made today in a very different way. So and I think without that really clear understanding, it's going to be very difficult for a government, be you a supporter of more hate speech laws or fewer, to get something over the line that society is going to go, oh yeah, I can see that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think, that opportunity is also lost, that's part of the select committee process, right? I mean, do I think, obviously Labor currently has a majority that could have sent that legislation as intended to a select committee to get feedback on, and then have come back and you could have come back and said, okay, look, we don't think we can do this in its current form. We have all these issues with it, yada, yada, yada. But they've just come out and said, oh, actually, we can't do this. And I think that's the kind of frustrating thing is experts in law and, members of our community experience hate speech and the consequences of it all haven't been able to come together in one mediated forum where we rely on facts and evidence and building legislation as part of our framework. We haven't had that opportunity. And that's, frustrating because it feels like there hasn't been an opportunity for any of us to present the argument. I mean, I've been doing, a bunch of media today on why I think we should have hate speech laws, but there's been no impetus for me to do that before when they were considering it, because they never put anything up for consultation from the public to have a discussion. I'm talking about it now because the government have said, actually, no, we're not going to do it. And I think, that's the frustrating, piece for me is, and I think also the conversation around hate speech and the conversation about free speech generally, right, is so dictated by culture wars in the United States and the kind of, this absolute right that, people, believe that they have to free speech because they've, watched a few American movies and know about the First Amendment, right? There are so many ways in this country that we restrict free speech. I mean, we have a government position called a chief censor, for God's sakes. I mean, we have, in a variety of ways, limitations on the speech that we as New Zealanders, can or cannot say, and largely no one's debating those existing provisions, right? I mean, I take the example of libel laws and of defamation. Yep. I can't say something that's untrue about you that damages your reputation, but suddenly we put an individual's reputation on a higher pedestal than the lives, in some cases the lives and freedom of enjoyment of vulnerable communities. The balance, I think, is wrong. If we were having a very measured discussion about what, how we look at speech and within our legislative framework, I think we'd find a lot of contradictions in the kind of arguments that, people like the Free Speech Union are making and going, actually, how do we regulate speech in this country? Do we think that this is a good thing? And do we think that, on balance, this is a positive and reduce harm? And I think the overwhelming majority of cases where we do that in this country, it does reduce harm. And I do believe that hate speech would be another example, but I don't think we've had the opportunity to come together and hash out these issues of, of what crosses that line into speech that we would outlaw.
If you say anything about me that's not true, you don't have to worry, because I don't have a reputation. So it says nothing can be harmed. Hey, I was going to say, not that this matters, but if people are at all interested, 12 months ago, I actually did a conversation on hate speech laws right there. It's on, this is with, and we did as other necessary with Paul Hunt from the Human Rights Commission debating one side of it, and Daphne Whitmore taking the con. The question was a recent Royal Commission. It's about the Royal Commission. Tonight we debate if hate speech laws are necessary, and we had Paul Hunt on one side and we had Daphne Whitmore on the other. So there's some people out there who have been talking about it, Max. There are some people. There's a couple of people out there who have been talking about it. Here's the one thing I was going to kind of wrap up with, because this is, and I'm not part of your rainbow community, yeah, but I kind of, so I don't get it entirely, because it doesn't impact me. So I'm just being really honest and saying, you know, I'm a cisgendered 6'4" white male who's never really suffered in the hands of being in public or being fearful for my safety or any of that kind of stuff. So I can empathize with it, and I can hear people's stories and understand, but I don't have a personal understanding of it, right? And saying all of that, there was something that I really offended me, almost, maybe the wrong word, upset me, from what the minister had to say in the weekend when she talked about this. Because even if I don't understand it, I hear your community and I hear what your community says about the vulnerable nature of the rainbow community. And this is when she said this about including the religious community to legislation. This is what she said.
As we bring about these small changes to the Human Rights Act, is to ask political leaders to do what they can to minimise harm, make sure that we're looking after those most vulnerable within our communities, and let the debate that we have, let it be an intelligent, well-versed debate that's based on principles, not snap grab one-liners for media soundbites.
The thing that I found most sort of abhorrent about that sentence is her talking about the most vulnerable. So she's putting the religious community and identifying it as the most vulnerable. Now, there's sometimes debate out there about harms that are done and stats around harms that are done within the rainbow community. But I struggle to believe, from someone who understands a bit about religious communities, that the religious community in general are more vulnerable than many in the rainbow community. So I don't know how you felt about her saying that, but I took umbrage at it based on what I understand my friends and family and colleagues are saying, what they face within that community. And what I hear is, we're going to look after these people who are the most vulnerable, but the ones that I understand are more vulnerable, we'll leave them out. Whether the legislation is good, bad, or indifferent, just that idea that the religious community are basically the most vulnerable kind of fucked me off, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's frustrating, because obviously we're talking about huge groups with so many intersectionalities within them, right? Like, you know, if you were to ask, you know, me if I thought as a, you know, a cisgender white, you know, gay man, if I felt more vulnerable than, you know, a Muslim individual after the, you know, March 15 attacks, I would say, no, actually, okay, that Muslim person would have felt, you know, more vulnerable, right? And I think there are nuances, obviously, within this conversation, different intersectionalities that we bring to the vulnerable equation, if you like. And so, yeah, I don't think that the government or the minister could sit there and quite rightly say.
You're being very polite, Max. You're being very polite, and because listen, the reason that, and I support my Muslim friends and community around me, but the reason that the Muslim community feels so vulnerable at the moment is because of a horrific act of terrorism committed on them on March 15th. I'm not the expert here, but when I stop and listen, the reason that I hear so many feel so vulnerable within the rainbow community is because it's hard for them to live their day-to-day life without any terrorist attack going on at all the time. So I understand what you're saying, and I'm not making that comment to disparage the Muslim community, but you wouldn't say the most vulnerable when it came to the Christian community. You wouldn't say the most vulnerable when it came to the Baha'i community. You wouldn't say, so it's because of a horrific act that the Muslims are at the top of the list, so to speak, and I'm there with them. But it's not just because of who they are and how they live that they're made to be vulnerable. It's because they were attacked in one horrific event. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I do think that for the minister to kind of say that we are protecting the most vulnerable by this announcement is not true. And my personal views on religion, of course, is that it is an individual choice for people. Obviously we in the rainbow community are not at liberty to choose who we are. And I think anyone that thinks we do, I don't know why in this current climate you think we would choose this way.
Yeah.
But that is the fundamental difference here. You are right. And do I believe that anyone should be, persecuted or discriminated against because of that religion they chose? Absolutely not.
Yeah, agreed.
But, to say that they are the most vulnerable, again, there are these nuances within it, but generally, do I agree with that statement? No, especially when it's in the context of excluding other vulnerable minority groups from hate speech legislation that it was kind of designed to protect.
Hey, Max, it's been so lovely to speak to you today. Anything you want to leave the audience with?
I don't think so, really. I just think, it's been great to have these conversations with people, and I think we will continue to have these conversations. And I think this is a good thing, and I think it's it's important for us to continue to have, as the minister said, kind of intelligent, well-reasoned discussions around these kind of laws and how they interact with each other. It's kind of a shame that we're having these conversations off the back of a decision that I disagree with. But hey, we don't know what the outcome of that law commission work will be that the government is undertaking with respect to the communities they left out of this announcement. And who knows whatever the outcome of the election is next year could well bring these changes in future. And I very much hope that's the case.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. I mean, yeah, we'll see what happens. But look, I was going to say, I feel sad that you haven't experienced much kind of public conversation with this other than when decisions are made. Don't be a stranger. You know where we are. Come on whenever you want. Come and tell us, update us, tell us what's going on, tell us what's happening, because we want to hear it. Even if you want to tell us about Auckland Pride and what's going on there, so we can tell people all about it at the 1st to the 26th of Feb next year for a big party.
Yes, no, and if you are based in Tamaki Makaurau, we, for your audience and yourself, obviously, I don't know where you are based, but we are launching tomorrow in the Auckland Art Gallery for the 2023 festival. So if you're around, come to Auckland Art Gallery, Toyo Tamaki, 7 p.m, and we've got some exciting things to launch tomorrow.
It's been amazing to have you on, Max. Max Tweedie is the Executive Director of Auckland Pride. Find out more about them at aucklandpride.org.nz. Max, thanks for joining us, man. Really appreciated it.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Pat.